All right. So, as you heard, the title is "How Do We Empower Equity?" And thinking about again this intersection between race, class, and place. And so, when we navigate all the characteristics of geography, how does that landscape actually produce energy injustices? But then, how does it allow us to actually achieve energy justice in reality? So some of you, may have seen this slide from me and some of my colleagues at the department before, but we're in a moment now where we have this grand challenge. It's really thinking about, um, we're in a period of energy transition that is also enhanced by, environmental and climate crises. And we have this policy window that is allowing us to do something extraordinary in transforming our energy system. But the challenge we have is how do we do these things, respond to the crisis, transition our energy economy, but ensuring whatever new system we are creating or create is more equitable and just. And so that is like what we are really trying to solve for. And so for folks who aren't deep into energy justice or thinking about what does this mean? I've heard of environmental justice, I've heard of climate justice. Why do we need energy justice? I wanted to just, provide one of the definitions that exists. And it really is how do we achieve this goal of equity in both the social and economic participation in the energy system, but also remediating the social, economic, and health burdens of those who've been historically harmed by the energy system. And this comes from the Institute of Energy Justice. So it's really this forward-thinking idea of social and economic participation, but also the recognition of the harm, and that can be defined in multiple ways that the energy system has caused on historically disadvantaged communities. But it also does something really unique, I think, and why we can drill down to focus specifically on energy justice is that it recognizes and stands on the shoulders of the environmental justice movement and scholarship of the 80s that continues, that really bridge the gap between the analysis of the environmental impacts on communities of color, low-income communities, and that connection to place, and then the progressive or proactive approach of climate justice to kind of stave off the impacts of the climate crisis. But so many of the issues that both of those movements and bodies of scholarship address are rooted in our energy system. And so energy justice allows us to kind of isolate the energy injustices and impacts that we're trying to prevent. And so this quote here from Kirsten Jenkins, a scholar out of the UK, I think kind of bridges that gap between environmental and climate justice that says energy justice concept provides a more focused mean to tackle the injustices with environment and climate knock-ons. And so energy justice has existed in our kind of international context for some time. UN goal, Sustainable Development Goal number 7, really gets at the crux of energy justice and how we're thinking about it internationally. That says goal number 7 is to ensure access to affordable, reliable, and sustainable modern energy for all. And Diana Hernandez out of Colombia back in 2015 issued a call for energy justice. If we consider energy as a basic right, she said there are like 4 rights that we should be thinking about. And that is the right to healthy, sustainable energy production, the right to the best available energy infrastructure, the right to energy that's affordable, and the right to energy that's uninterrupted. And we know there are a lot of scholars now looking at energy insecurity and energy affordability issues, as well as energy outages. And so if we begin to think about energy as a right, what are those rights that should be guaranteed? Now, keep in mind that in most places, energy is not a right in any constitution, it's not codified in any law. And so these are still normative ideas, but they have gained a lot of attention, and people are thinking more about codifying energy into certain bodies of legislation or law. And then there are some interrelated tenets that allow us to kind of, again, bridge the gap between energy and theories of justice. I show three here. There's a fourth one that people include corrective justice, which is really where we're trying to go. But to understand the injustices, these three tenets actually get us there. And so we have distributional injustices that can be created by income inequalities, inequities in energy prices, inequities in energy efficiency. We have procedural injustices when people lack access to information, are not able to participate in the decision-making process, or they have no legal rights to take against energy companies or energy providers, or even their government when it comes to their energy access, their energy affordability, and the impacts of energy on their lives. And then recognition justice, really recognizing communities that are more vulnerable than others, the needs of communities when it comes to energy, such as people who need energy for life-saving devices, medical devices, and then a level of respect, actually understanding how we approach communities from a place of respect when we talk about energy. We see a lot of tension now between the clean energy transition, particularly our clean energy build out, and land rights with indigenous communities. And so when we think about moving toward energy justice for whom? I've spent the last decade of my work really trying to look at those tenets and understand disparities that exist. And most of that boils down to understanding injustices related to race, to class, primarily socioeconomic or sociodemographic characteristics, and then this idea of place and geography. And so I want to talk a little bit quickly about energy and race. And again, my goal here is to kind of hit some highlights that I've been just reflecting on about some of these intersections, and then end with a case out of the Department of Energy, a program out of the Department of Energy that begins to move us toward this idea of actually achieving energy equity, energy justice. And so when I started this work back in 2009, 2010, I always tell people this quote was really what kind of pushed me to explore this issue. My letter of interest for my PhD was on rain gardens. I'm a civil engineer. I was really interested in kind of the distribution of green infrastructure. But doing interviews in Kansas City during the recession, really talking to African-American elders and communities in the city, and people were talking about their energy bill. They didn't really want to talk about rain gardens, although EPA had funding for rain gardens, particularly in communities that had combined sewer systems. And so I kept trying to bring up, flooding and rain gardens, but energy kept coming up. And so I really wanted to dig in to the intersection of energy and race, and found this report from 2004 that was funded by the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. And the executive summary starts with this sentence: where U.S. energy policy is concerned, African Americans are the proverbial canaries in the mine shaft. And it got me to thinking more about what does energy look like in predominantly African American communities, whether it's affordability, whether it's energy infrastructure, whether it's energy use and consumption at home. And so over the last few years, I've been trying to do some historical research to understand when this actually came into the lexicon of this connection between energy and race. And again, this issue of crisis or transition has come up in many of the things that I found. And so again, this is one of those ideas where I'm still trying to make some connection here, but just wanted to share some of the interesting things that I've identified. And so in the 1970s, we had an energy crisis that was based on geopolitical issues, similar to what we saw last spring with the Russia-Ukraine war. The oil-producing companies of the Middle East, raised the prices of energy for other countries. And so we had this energy crisis, energy shortage in the US in the 1970s. People had to choose what day they went and got gas. A lot of gas stations closed. And as I was searching, Jet Magazine, which is a popular magazine, or was a popular magazine in the African American community, actually had a several page article about what the energy crisis was doing to US Blacks. And so I just got a copy of that recently and started reading through it. And it talked about energy at home, as well as the inability to find gas in certain communities, gas stations closing because they couldn't get access. Unequal supply to Black operated gas stations versus non-Black operated gas stations. And so again, these issues very tied to other incidences of racial discrimination. But the federal government also responded in this time, not solely on the issues of race and income, but did recognize that, but created some programs that actually focused on weatherizing, making low-income homes more efficient. So the Weatherization Assistance Program was created in 1976 and has existed since then. The Department of Energy was actually created, bringing together some of the different energy-related parts of the government in 1977. Within the Department of Energy, in 1978, Congress actually created an Office of Minority Economic Impact, which is the office that I served in, which became the Office of Economic Impact and Diversity, and Secretary Granholm last year renamed that office the Office of Energy Justice and Equity. There was also a program that was created in the late 70s, the Petroleum Violation Escrow Account, and that money was deposited in minority banks. Energy companies were sued because they were actually overcharging in minority communities for gas and energy at that time. And so that, again, recognition of the injustices in the energy system. And then we also started to collect data on residential energy consumption with the first residential energy consumption survey in 1978. The report I talked about from 2004 also recognized that as we were thinking about addressing climate change with the carbon tax in the early 2000s, that there was this emissions paradox between Black households and white households at that time, and found that African Americans emitted 20% less carbon than white households. Some colleagues and I at University of Michigan got access to thousands of energy consumption data from across the country, and kind of updated that analysis and found that in the late 2020 or early 2020s, African Americans emitted 10% less carbon than white households, but exhibited a higher energy use intensity, or EUI, which is a proxy for energy efficiency. And so the higher the number, the less efficient the home is. And so you have this, dynamic between African Americans living in less energy efficient homes, which means higher energy bills, but still this, kind of action where African Americans are probably under consuming to deal with higher energy costs, deal with inefficient homes. And we also found a relationship between these higher EUIs and formerly redlined neighborhoods, so communities that were designed by policy to be racially segregated. And so I spoke to that affordability issue. The American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy has been doing energy burden studies for some time now, and show that the median Black household has a 43% higher energy burden than a white household. Hispanics have a 20% higher, and Native Americans have a 45% higher energy burden. So that proportion of their income that they're spending on energy bills. We think about kind of the socioeconomics and sociodemographics of energy. This quote from the executive director of the International Energy Agency gets at the importance of energy in our everyday lives. Energy is the linchpin of economic prosperity, with energy security, reliability, and affordability as key preconditions for sustainable growth. And so another crisis point where the government has made infusions of investment in the energy system was during the economic recession of the late 2000s. And again, this is when I got into this work, and particularly the weatherization program I talked about that started in the late 70s. You can see that blue line on the chart there is the weatherization program funding. It kind of hovers around $200 million annually. But in 2009, when the economic stimulus was passed, that program got $5 billion to be spent over 3 years. So again, a program that's usually around $200,000, does about 30,000 homes, now received $5 billion and was able to do 775,000 homes within that time. And then as we came into the current administration, again, another moment of both economic crisis, environmental crisis, political crises, but energy also was, again, facing its own crisis from multiple fronts. So we had an affordability issue because of the pandemic. So we saw millions of shutoffs to households because people were either losing their jobs or, at home more than they were used to being home. Climate change, creating extreme temperatures, people literally freezing to death. There's a story of a mother and a son in the west side of Detroit freezing to death in their home because their power was shut off. A report, Powerless in the Pandemic, showed how many people, and geographically showing where more shutoffs were occurring than others. We had attacks on our energy infrastructure. And again, we saw Storm Uri in Texas, the largest energy producing state, being shut down by the effects of the climate crisis. Now, when it comes to place, my colleague Shalonda Baker, in her Revolutionary Power book, had this quote that I think really gets at a couple of maps that I want to show you here next. And it says, the energy system routinely sacrifices brown, black, and indigenous bodies to keep the lights on for the majority. And so some colleagues and I were working on a study for communities in the Detroit metro. So what you see here is a map of 3 counties in the Detroit metro: Oakland County, Macomb County, and Wayne County, where Detroit is. And on the left-hand side, and I have 3 images here. So on the left-hand side will always be electricity consumption. The red areas are primarily the suburban communities of the Detroit metro. Red is higher levels, yellow is lower levels. So red is higher consumption on the left, yellow is lower energy consumption. On the right, you see kind of the racial demographics of the 3 counties. Red is higher communities of color, yellow, lower communities of color. And so what we see here is that suburban communities, on average, are consuming a lot more electricity than communities of color. Now, there's a circle there you can see with an arrow. That's a cluster of power plants, coal or natural gas power plants. Happy to announce that the coal plant there has since closed in the last couple of years, but we still have natural gas plants in the community. And so what this shows is, in this cluster where energy was being produced, the communities around that area were consuming, on average, less energy than the communities out in the suburbs. And so they're hosting the dirty energy generation, but consuming it less. This next map, the right map change, this is energy burden. So the percentage of people's income that they spend on energy. So redder areas, people are spending more of their income on energy. And you see here, again, red areas right around where you have the dirty energy generation. And so these communities are, consuming less energy, but paying a greater proportion of their income on that energy that they're consuming less of and that they can barely afford. When you see yellow and kind of orange colors, lower energy burdens out in the suburbs where people are consuming more energy and don't have to deal with the generation. And then when you think about other vulnerabilities, right, what other things make communities vulnerable, whether it's poverty and less education, percent renters, linguistic isolation, again, those redder areas around the dirty generation of energy, but less so in the communities that are actually benefiting from that generation but don't have to deal with the pollution and the other impacts of the energy system. And so as we go through recognizing the disparities, looking at the disparities, how do we come out of this, right? How do we do something about this? And so, as we think through, the iteration of achieving energy justice, one way to do that is with a data-driven, community-based approach. And this is where data and geovisualization, community engagement all come together to create plans to achieve energy justice. And so this type of approach supports equity and justice and democracy. It acknowledges that this whole kind of decision-making process of energy is super complex, and it can't be described through some of our traditional rational economic models. When you do a community-based approach, you can create social connectedness as a way to transform the way people interact with energy, relying on things like group interaction, peer support, and communal resolve. And then it also creates institutional capabilities. And then you can learn how to effectively deliver other services, but also respond to the fluidity of what's happening at a local micro scale. And so how is this being achieved or addressed through the federal government? I consider Executive Order 14008, which created the Justice 40 Initiative, as our approach to corrective justice. The president, vice president have made environmental and energy justice cornerstones of the administration. I will say that is not easy, and it is, a work in progress, definitely. But we have a framework, we have a foundation to actually address this. And so the Justice 40 Initiative was created by Section 223 of the Climate EO, as some people call it. It's the Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad executive order that was signed in the president's first week. And it addresses all of our investments, federal investments in climate change, clean energy, clean transportation, affordable housing, workforce development, remediation of pollution, and clean water. And it centers for us at the Department of Energy when I was there, the ambition of the transition around equity. So it allowed us to actually rethink all of our programming and center it on equity. And so now here we are in this moment where, unprecedented funding to do something about the climate crisis, to do something about our infrastructure. As we grow our dependency on electricity, we see more and more climate change extremes in California, Florida, all across the country, but still attacks on the infrastructure, cyber attacks. And all of this is exacerbating the harms that we already know exist. But now we have a very vocal, eager, and engaged public. You might have seen in Georgia, people were actually excited about a public service commission election. And so we know that people are engaged in energy. It could definitely be more. This idea of energy democracy is growing, and we have money. I don't think we can underscore how important that is to actually have billions of dollars to do something about this. And so the guiding principles at the Department of Energy to ensure energy justice were driven by 8 policy priorities. First, reducing energy burden in disadvantaged communities. And so I talked about, people of color spending more of their income on energy. And so recognizing that as an issue, how do we design programs that are actually addressing that? Reducing environmental exposure and burdens, increasing parity in clean energy access and adoption, recognizing that all communities are not adopting clean energy at the same rate or scale. It costs money to go green. So how do we increase access to low-cost capital? You see a lot of rebates in the IRA. That's not perfect, right? And so some of the appliance rebate programs in certain states are being designed so the rebates are at the point of sale rather than having someone spend that up cost capital and try to get a rebate later. And so again, recognizing that everybody can't just go out and buy an induction stove with their own upfront capital. And so finding creative ways to make that happen. Creating new businesses, creating new jobs, focusing on energy resiliency, and then again, focusing on energy democracy. So being able to talk about energy democracy in a very um, technical agency was really something to see. And so Justice 40 lives in an executive order. There are a lot of challenges with it being in an executive order because it's not law. And so it also is very fragile. If there were a change in administration, things could, it could be repealed. And so our challenge was to find ways to make Justice 40 real, integrate it into policy design, program design, in a way that would give it some sustainability in case it was ever threatened. And so one way we did that was all the funding from the infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act into the funding documents, the way the funding programs are designed. We included something called community benefits plans. And so it has several areas, but now any applicant to Department of Energy funding has to submit a community benefits plan. And the idea was that this will foster early and often engagement. It will have applicants think about how are they delivering Justice 40 benefits, those 8 policy priorities that are applicable to anybody's project. How are they actually going to deliver those? Focusing on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, particularly in the workforce, and creating good jobs. Again, another challenge of the energy transition is the loss of traditional energy jobs, but also the opportunity to create jobs in places that, have high unemployment or a lack of manufacturing jobs. And so to make those real, applicants have to create workforce and community agreements with the places that they are building their infrastructure. And so I want to wrap up with an example that kind of preceded the infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, but is an example of the types of programming that have changed in the Department of Energy to really think about corrective justice and how we make energy justice real, focusing on a place-based, community-based approach. And so the secretary encouraged several offices within the department to pool resources to think about how to support community-informed, community-developed ideas for the clean energy transition. A big goal here was to prepare communities with technical assistance when the big funding started to roll out, that they would have plans in place, they would have coalitions in place to receive these dollars. And so again, facilitate, sustain community-wide economic and environmental benefits. And it was specifically focused on low-income, energy burdened communities and those that had direct environmental impacts from the energy system or direct economic impacts if they were shifting away from traditional fossil fuel economies. And so we matched different technical assistance providers with community coalitions to develop their clean energy vision. And one I want to highlight really quickly is here locally where I am, Highland Park, Michigan. Highland Park has a very kind of unique story. I've worked with Highland Park for just under a decade now. A community that was at the height of its, kind of population during the auto industry boom, but is now just a fragment of its population with only 10,000 people. I think at one point it was, one of the larger cities in Michigan. It is definitely now one of the most segregated and economically depressed cities in the country. 92% of the population is Black, 46.5% of the population is at or below poverty. But the opportunity is the community recognizes its history. It's where the Model T was created. And so the community recognizes its place in history, despite economic collapse, redlining, historic disinvestment in its infrastructure, everything from energy to water. An interesting story there is the utility company, when the city couldn't pay its utility fees for streetlights, took out all the streetlights in the city. And so a group of community members got together, and started doing solar street lights at certain corners, having to put the street light in people's yard because they couldn't access the right of way. And so that kind of spirit of thinking about a community solution brought together a very unique coalition. And so working with the Department of Energy, they wanted to do several things. Figure out a distribution grid capacity and reliability analysis that they could present to the utility company. Assess the impacts of having a vulnerable grid. So really analyzing outages, analyzing the inability to add new infrastructure like EV charging. They want to understand how to improve their grid, reliability, and then regulatory analysis, financial models, and implementation best practice strategies, because they wanted to think about creating a municipal co-op to do a street lighting program, deploy distributed energy. And so if the utility will not provide the services that they need, how could they do that at the community scale, supporting their municipal government, or creating a community co-op to do some of these other energy services that the utility company is not providing. Also looking at their residential building stock to come up with their energy efficiency potential, and then create an action plan so they could prepare for all of the funding that will be coming from the federal government. And this took a lot of community engagement. Residents were kept informed about the process, many workshops. Highland Park has a couple, community started villages, they call them. One of the villages, Avalon Village, the director and creator of that was just up for a CNN Champions Award. I forget what it's called, but again, the community is getting recognized, and some of their work with the department is allowing them to go for additional funding. And I hope to see like an actual difference and change in the way their energy is provisioned, as well as is supporting them in some of their other infrastructure. They just got a big grant from the state of Michigan to fix their water infrastructure. And so again, that institutional capacity is being created to address other issues when sometimes energy just becomes the kind of first rung of doing that work together. So that's all I have for you all today. I look forward to a conversation about any of the topics that I kind of went through, other folks that are working on kind of issues of energy justice. I'd love to hear some thoughts or any questions that you have. So back to everybody else.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say thank you so much, Tony. And I think we can, have folks either just unmute yourself and pose questions, or you can drop them in the chat and we can sort of curate. Go ahead.
I have a question, actually. Thank you very much for the webinar. So when you were explaining the case of Highland Park, what type of equity is more central? I will explain what I mean. We have recognition justice, procedural justice, and distributional justice. So to me, it sounds like in Highland Park, they're more focused on how to distribute the benefits or the infrastructure. Is there, maybe they're deploying other frameworks? I don't know. I just appreciate if you let me know what sort of framework is supporting and theoretically of these implementation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. So I think the recognition justice component was on the federal government, right? We recognize that there are communities with high energy burdens, communities that actually have ideas that they want to address. And so creating a program that actually had the characteristics of environmental justice issues, energy burden issues, as well as energy transition, economic issues, was recognition justice on the government's component. And so creating a program that people could identify themselves in those characteristics. Highland Park's case was primarily the distributional justice issues that they had already recognized, and trying to kind of document and visualize those, do the analysis. And then the procedural justice was another component. Like, how do you get people engaged in the energy process. And so doing the community engagement, actually bringing a coalition together of people who kind of have their own ways they were approaching this in their kind of smaller area of the city, but bringing them together so they could come up with a kind of citywide, more cohesive plan to present to both the local government. And so that's something interesting to talk about with Communities Lead. It had to be a community group and a local government, at least a community group and a local government as the applicant, the co-applicants. And so we were also trying to bring community groups and cities together, because a lot of funding from DOE goes to government, state or local governments. And so we wanted to see that collaboration. So I think the Highland Park case is a good example of both distributive and procedural justice.
Go ahead, Mia.
Hello, thank you so much for this amazing presentation. It's very exciting. I'm over here in New York. I teach at the New School and I'm working in community. My focus is on community land trust. So over here, we're thinking about the IRA and the community change grants in particular, and thinking about obviously community infrastructure. So when you said the municipal community co-ops structure around energy, I just thought, could you say a little bit more about that? Because I'm taking furious notes because we're going into a planning session to plan, and we're thinking about really building out this framework of the intersection between housing, energy, climate, EJ, justice, and people are already there, but also are definitely interested in supportive language to help them make the case around that intersection. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Mia. And we definitely can follow up offline because I think there's some interesting cases here in Michigan as well as some other states when it comes to the provisioning of energy services that may or may not be provided by the local investor-owned utility, and what that relationship still looks like. I think the Highland Park case is unique and interesting because of the tense relationship between Highland Park residents and the utility company. And so just like the utility, the city has their local water infrastructure. It was trying to think through, could they also do the street lighting? So it was primarily for the replacement of street lighting, and thinking, could that be a part of their city utility? Some of the other work that we've done with that community was looking at a co-op model for energy efficiency. And so could people pay into a co-op that has a board that decides energy efficiency projects, whether they do it block by block, a house has a certain need and they can move up on the list of priority. And so that is another model that they were looking at to, not just focus on the delivery of electrons, but actually saving and reducing energy consumption. And there's a workforce component and all to both cases.
Thank you. Maybe let's hear from Hisham and then Ryan.
Hi, Tony. Hisham Zarifi from University
Hey.
of Columbia. How you doing?
Yeah, good to see you.
Good. See you too. So I guess one thing I'm thinking about everything you've said, and one thing tensions I keep coming back to is the scale and pace of the transformative change that's needed, and then the need for it to all same time be place-based, context-dependent, high touch, community consultation and bringing people together, and that takes time, and it's very different from one community to the other community, and like how that tension is something I've always kind of come back to, of like, how do you do this in so many different communities, in a time frame that we need? And any thoughts you might have on that?
Yeah, that's a really great question too. And like you said, that is a major tension. I mean, because you can take something like transmission as an example of something that we need to do nationwide, but you're talking about 50 plus state 50 state jurisdictions plus local jurisdictions with however many counties or cities are within the state. So no direct answer there, but I do think so I'll give one example. The IRA home rebates. So that those funds will go to states as block grants, right? And so state energy offices are applying for those funds to the department. So about $9 billion in both home retrofits and appliance replacements. The fear is that there will be 50 different ways this is done, right? Which is likely to occur. And so part of the department's challenge and task was to begin to create best practices from those early states that will be able to deploy these funds, and then use those best practices to hopefully fit those into the other states that will come later so they can speed up their deployment. And so it takes that kind of those first adopters that have all the context and then trying to look at states and say, okay, well, this model likely fits your state, and then they have fewer tweaks to make. And so that's one of the ones that like the secretary would love if everybody could be getting rebates like today. But unfortunately, it took a lot of time to design that program, and then it took more time to get states to design their program to apply. And so that's one where we have a need for speed. And so the hope is that the early adopters can provide lessons learned for the other states. And so that's just one example that I could think of pretty quick. Right.
Hey, Tony.
Hey.
I'm Ryan Stock at Northern Michigan University, also vice chair of the Energy and Environment Specialty Group. I do research on energy justice also, and I've been following your work closely over the past several years. So thank you for all the work you do, and thank you for joining us today. I think this has been such a wonderful and illuminating talk. In your work at the DOE, like what considerations or interventions have been made to rectify the gendered energy injustices in energy regimes that disproportionately impact low-income communities of color?
Could you talk a little more, give me a little more?
Well, we know that in terms of like household reproduction, in terms of like energy use, right? Like women are often disproportionately impacted by energy injustices all over the world. Certainly here in the United States, if there's blackouts, shutoffs, things of that nature. And so in addition to socioeconomic class, which you discussed, and the racial dimensions of these energy injustices that you study, any programs that specifically target gender also that you can speak to or that you were involved in?
Yeah, that's a really great question and a really great area of, I think further inquiry, right? We see that show up particularly in the international energy justice research with things like cook stoves and wood gathering. But I think, if I can think about how it came up in my time at DOE, it was primarily in the workforce development, looking at disparities in gender participation in the workforce. And so trying to create programs that focus on women-owned businesses, STEM programs to get women into the energy workforce. I don't think it didn't come up a lot as far as like the affordability issues. It was primarily in workforce development, which I think again is another critical area for the transition. Who's in the workforce, and then how does that support adoption disparities that we see when it comes to clean energy in particular. Yeah. Thank you.
Maybe let's hear from Samuel, and then we could take a question from the chat. Go ahead, Samuel.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just want to find out a few things about the Justice 40 initiative. The first thing is about the investment. Are we looking at investment from the perspective of government, or from both from the government perspective and then from the industry perspective in terms of companies? And the second thing that I want to find out is, are there strategies that are in place to ensure that these objectives of the Justice 40 initiatives are implemented and met? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Samuel. So the Justice 40 initiative as a federal initiative is looking at federal investments, so government investments, measuring where those investments go, what benefits flow from those investments. So that was a really interesting challenge to think about what is a benefit of an investment, right? And so one of the kind of constitutional challenges that we faced with Justice 40 is that there are limits to actually tying dollars to things like particularly race and place, right? And so that's why you see the benefits of investments. And so you can look at all these other benefits that might flow from those investment dollars. And so that was a way to get around that. And so at DOE, we came up with those 8 policy priorities that have metrics tied to them. And so energy burden reduction based on federal dollars that are given to different states or companies that apply for federal dollars. Does their infrastructure construction impact the energy burden in the place where that infrastructure was collected? So some of that analysis is just starting because even when I explain that, it's super complicated to do, right? And so that is going to be the challenge of like how we actually measure 40% of a benefit, trying to define what a benefit is, and trying to define where that benefit actually accrues. What we've seen and what I think is super interesting is that states, local governments, and actors in the private sector have actually adopted that approach and thinking about how they deploy and implement Justice 40 goals. And so the hope is that Justice 40 as a concept will, live outside of the government, regardless of, who's in the White House, and who's in the agencies. And so I think we're in an interesting, unique opportunity where this Justice 40 thinking is actually living outside of the government, but the government will create ways to kind of track, measure, and visualize those benefits. And then your second question, strategies. Was it strategies on Justice 40 or?
Yes, so I just wanted to find out whether there are some strategies in the policy initiative on ensuring that the objectives are met in the end.
Yeah. So when I talked about those community benefits plans, and so applicants to funding in their community benefits plans, we've given them like a set of metrics that they can track for Justice 40. And so in their applications, an applicant will talk about the metrics that they plan to track. There's a whole system where that data will go into, and the company that was contracted to analyze that data and visualize that data will start putting out annual reports. And it'll probably be a year before those type of reports are out. You may see some preliminary reports this year for reasons I'm sure we all can understand why. But it will be, as time goes on, I think we'll see things like maps that are showing benefits from investments, and applicants will be responsible for reporting that data into the government.
Thank you very much.
We had a question from Georgia in the chat on co-optation or change of EJ, energy justice, or an environmental justice language, and how definitions of that might be shifting some of the work that's being done on the ground.
So, yeah, definitions are challenging, right? I think even if we take the evolution of the environmental justice definition, environmental justice started as a very kind of, the term started as environmental racism, right? So it has transitioned or, kind of transposed into environmental justice. And if you look at some of the history of that term, particularly as it relates to how the federal government defines it, it went from really focusing on communities of color, low-income communities, to environmental justice for all, right? And again, that is baked into our Constitution and some of the challenges to particularly race-based, you know, equity efforts, right? And so if you think about the inability of the country to do reparations for descendants of slaves. And so I don't know if we see that as happening as fast in energy justice. I think because it's still new enough where you get to focus on some of the issues, and the data is very new, beginning to look at the disparities in the energy system. And so people are making clear cases about the relationship between race and place and energy. And so since this is a newer topic, but if you see instances of that, I would love to kind of hear how that's happening on the ground. I think we try to be pretty explicit in that. Some of you all may know, when the Federal Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool was first released, there was a challenge on whether that could be connected to race. And there was a lot of legal review on that. And so thinking about disadvantaged communities as a proxy is how you see a lot of states and the federal government addressing communities that have environmental, energy, and climate disparities.
We have a few more questions in the chat that are sort of touch on these last points. Let's see, Tony, do you maybe want to? Yeah, any comments on restorative justice or programming coming down the pipeline with all of this IRA and federal money? Yeah, maybe just a couple more minutes. We want to be respectful of everybody's time, but maybe you could synthesize on those last points.
Like I said, I think the opportunity here is so great, right? And I think that's, if I have one takeaway from my time at DOE, was that we were able to really shift the way people are thinking about like how funding leaves the federal government, right? Whether it's the accountability to ensure that it's equitably deployed, the kind of inherent justice call out in legislation. And so things like greenhouse gas reduction fund from EPA, specifically calling out communities with environmental justice issues, low-income communities. The rebates program actually calling out energy burden communities and low-income communities. And then within the departments, being able to further kind of design those programs to use data to actually say, this is why we're focusing on this population. That is super unique to kind of have that synergy between Congress and the agencies. The challenge that exists is once the money leaves DC, right? And so the energy democracy piece, the procedural justice piece is super important at the state and local level to ensure when those funds get to state and local governments that they are actually deployed and spent in the way that that people need, and that the intent of the law and program design is actually adhered to. So now it's on us. It's on all of us out here on the ground to actually make sure that equity and justice are realized.
Awesome. Well, I think with that, just want to do another big round of applause for Dr. Reames. Thank you for an amazing talk, super generative. I feel like we could probably stay here for a few more hours if we had time. So, and thank you to everybody for joining. This was a really, really great event. And thank you to Akira and Priscilla. It's awesome to collaborate with y'all, and so many cross-cutting themes. And yeah, thank you, everybody.
All right. Thanks, everybody.